I never thought the person who would make me feel invisible in my own life would be my own child. At a family dinner, surrounded by people who once called me mom, I was told I had until morning to leave the house I helped pay for. No argument, no explanation, just a deadline. Years of silence, sacrifice, and loyalty were dismissed with a single sentence. In that moment, I realized something painful but powerful. Love without respect becomes control, and patience without boundaries becomes permission. That night didn't just change where I lived, it changed who I was willing to be. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different cultures and places. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so don't hold back. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll always be the first to catch our latest tales. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey that might just change the way you see things. Let's dive in. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 58 years old, a widow, and someone who learned long ago how to make herself smaller in other people's lives. Cape May, New Jersey, has been my home for most of those years. It is a quiet coastal town where the ocean air carries both comfort and memory. My husband and I raised our daughter here, watched the seasons roll in and out, and built a life that felt steady until illness took him from me far too soon. After his death, the house felt too large and too silent. Every room echoed with things that were no longer there: his laugh, the creak of his footsteps, the routines we shared. When my daughter Rachel suggested I move in with her family, I told myself it was the sensible choice. She lived in a spacious home with a room for everyone, and I believed being close to my grandchildren would soften the loneliness. Rachel Bennett is 34, confident, ambitious, and successful in her real estate career. She moves through life with certainty, the kind that leaves little space for disagreement. Her house reflects that energy, modern, organized, and carefully controlled. At first, I tried to be helpful. I cooked, I watched the children, and I stayed out of the way. I reminded myself that this was her home, her rhythm, her rules. What Rachel rarely acknowledged was how much I had given to make that life possible. Years ago, when her credit history was less than perfect, I had signed for the mortgage so she could buy the house. I had paid for school supplies, summer camps, and emergency expenses without hesitation. When she struggled, I stepped in quietly. I never asked for thanks. I never expected repayment. I believed that support was simply what a mother did. But over time, the tone changed. Small things became reminders of my place. I was told which cabinets to use, where to sit, when to keep my opinions to myself. Rachel did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her certainty carried more weight than any argument. Her husband stayed polite but distant, and my grandchildren grew accustomed to seeing me as part of the background rather than the center of their world. I stopped offering advice. I stopped explaining myself. When I spoke, my words seemed to disappear into the air without leaving an impression. It was easier to stay quiet than to feel dismissed. I told myself that peace was worth the silence. Still, something inside me shifted. I began to notice how often my presence was treated as temporary, how my contributions were taken for granted, how decisions were made without so much as a glance in my direction. I felt less like a mother and more like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The house that once felt welcoming now felt conditional, as if my place within it depended entirely on my ability to stay invisible. I spent more time walking along the beach alone, letting the sound of the waves steady my thoughts. The ocean had a way of reminding me that change was natural, even necessary. I started to ask myself what I wanted, not just what I was willing to endure. The truth was uncomfortable. I had allowed myself to become quiet because it felt safer than being firm. I had chosen harmony over honesty, and in doing so, I had taught my own daughter that my boundaries were flexible, even optional. Rachel's confidence grew as my voice faded. She made decisions quickly, expected agreement, and rarely looked back. I watched it happen without interruption, convincing myself that patience was strength. But patience, I was beginning to realize, had turned into permission. The night of my grandson's birthday dinner approached like any other family gathering. Balloons, cake, familiar faces, and the usual expectation that everything would run smoothly. I told myself it would be just another evening, a moment to smile, to celebrate, to remain in my place. What I did not know was that this dinner would become the moment everything shifted. Not because I planned it that way, but because the silence I had carried for years was finally ready to break. And once it did, nothing in that house would feel the same again. If you're still watching and starting to feel the tension build, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what happened at that family dinner. The birthday party looked perfect from the outside. Colorful balloons lined the fence, a long table held trays of food, and music drifted through the open windows of the house. Friends, neighbors, and a few of Rachel's colleagues filled the backyard, laughing easily as if nothing in the world could disrupt the moment. I moved quietly among them, refilling drinks, straightening plates, and keeping to the edges where I was least noticed. I had learned how to be useful without being visible. My grandson ran past me with frosting on his fingers, his laughter bright and careless. I smiled, but the feeling did not quite reach my eyes. No one asked me to sit. No one asked my opinion. My role was clear: help where needed, stay out of the way, and do not disrupt the rhythm of Rachel's carefully arranged life. Rachel stood near the center of it all, confident and composed, greeting guests with the same practiced charm she used in her business. Her voice carried easily across the yard, firm and controlled. Watching her, I could see how much she valued order, how much she needed to feel in charge of every detail. When my grandson began to grow restless, snapping at his younger sister, I gently suggested he take a short break inside. It was not criticism, only concern. The words had barely left my mouth when Rachel turned toward me, her expression tightening. She did not shout. She did not need to. Her tone shifted just enough for the people nearby to hear. She reminded me, calmly but firmly, that she was the parent and that she did not need advice in her own home. The air around us grew still. Conversations nearby softened, curiosity replacing comfort. I felt the familiar pull to apologize, to smooth things over. For years, that instinct had guided my reactions. But this time, before I could speak, Rachel continued. Her voice carried across the backyard, clear and unmistakable. She told me that I had until morning to leave her house. The sentence landed heavier than any raised voice ever could. For a moment, no one moved. No one laughed. No one rushed to explain it away. Guests stared at their drinks or studied the decorations as if something else suddenly demanded their attention. Rachel's husband shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the ground. Not a single person spoke in my defense. I stood there, hands folded in front of me, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over my chest. The words should have hurt more than they did. Perhaps they would have, years earlier. But I had grown used to being reminded where I stood. What felt different was not the dismissal, but the clarity. There was no misunderstanding, no hidden meaning. My presence in that house had always been conditional, and now the condition had been spoken out loud. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Rachel turned away almost immediately, returning to her guests as if the moment had already passed. Laughter slowly returned, though it sounded thinner than before. The party continued, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The brightness felt forced, like a performance everyone was pretending to enjoy. I walked toward the side of the yard, letting the noise fade behind me. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, not from age alone, but from the weight of years spent shrinking myself for the comfort of others. I realized I was not angry. I was not even surprised. I was simply done. For too long, I had mistaken silence for peace and patience for strength. I had convinced myself that love meant endurance. But standing there, watching my own daughter erase me from her space with a single sentence, I understood that respect could not be borrowed or begged for. It had to be claimed. I did not announce my departure from the party. I did not create a scene. I gathered my purse, offered quiet smiles to those who avoided my eyes, and stepped inside the house. Each step felt deliberate, steady, and strangely light. By the time the front door closed behind me, I knew that this was not an ending, it was a warning. Not just for Rachel, but for myself. The silence I had carried for years was no longer protection, it was permission. And I had decided finally to take it back. If that moment shocked you as much as it shocked me, comment number 2 below to stay with the story. Now, let's see what I did next. Dinner that night felt nothing like a family gathering. The long table was set the same way it always was, but the air carried a stiffness that no amount of polite conversation could soften. Plates clinked quietly, and the hum of the refrigerator filled the spaces where laughter used to live. No one mentioned the birthday party. No one mentioned the words that had been spoken. Silence had become the new agreement. I took my seat without waiting for instruction. That alone felt different. Rachel sat at the head of the table, posture straight, expression composed, as if the afternoon had never happened. Her husband scrolled through his phone. The children picked at their food, distracted and unaware of the tension surrounding them. Everyone seemed to be pretending that nothing had shifted. But something had. I reached into my purse and placed a small brown leather envelope on the table, followed by a single brass house key. The soft sound they made against the wood was enough to draw attention. Forks paused midair. Rachel's eyes flicked toward me, her brow tightening slightly. I did not explain myself. I simply folded my hands in front of me and let the object speak first. After a moment, I said quietly that by tomorrow, the house would not feel the same. Rachel let out a short laugh, the kind meant to dismiss rather than entertain. She assumed I was being dramatic, playing into some emotional display that she believed she still controlled. Her confidence rested on the idea that I had always backed down before. She saw no reason to expect anything different now. No one else reached for the envelope. No one asked what the key was for. Curiosity lingered in the air, but caution kept it contained. It was easier for them to stay silent than to challenge what they did not understand. Inside, I felt calm in a way I had not experienced for years. I was no longer waiting for approval. I was no longer measuring my words for comfort. The truth was already written, sealed, and ready. Whether they wanted to face it or not was no longer my responsibility. Rachel grew restless. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table. She asked what the envelope was supposed to prove, her tone sharp with impatience. I met her gaze without flinching. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply held the silence until it became uncomfortable for her instead of me. Her husband glanced between us, uncertain. He was used to Rachel steering every conversation, used to her certainty shaping the room. My quiet resistance unsettled that balance. The envelope remained unopened. The longer it sat there, the heavier it seemed to become. It was no longer just paper and leather. It was a reminder that control was not as permanent as Rachel believed. The house key beside it caught the overhead light, gleaming like a quiet challenge. I felt no urge to explain myself. For years, I had filled every uncomfortable pause with apologies. Now, I let the stillness do the work for me. Rachel finally demanded to know what I thought I was accomplishing. Her confidence cracked just enough to reveal irritation beneath it. She was used to answers, used to obedience, used to being in charge. I remained seated, steady and composed. I told her that some things did not need immediate explanation. Some things only needed time. The room grew tense. Even the children seemed to sense the shift, their movements slowing, their voices fading. No one reached for dessert. No one changed the subject. The moment refused to be ignored. In that silence, I realized how powerful it felt to stop shrinking. For the first time in years, I was not asking for space. I was taking it. The envelope and the key stayed on the table, untouched and undeniable. They were not threats. They were facts, waiting for the right moment to be understood. And that moment was coming. If you're curious about what was inside that envelope, comment number 3 below so I know you're still watching. Now, let's uncover the truth. The dishes from dinner remained on the table long after everyone had finished eating. No one rushed to clear them away, as if movement itself might disturb the uneasy balance that had settled over the room. The envelope and the brass key were still there, untouched, quietly demanding attention without saying a word. Rachel was the first to break the silence. Her patience, so carefully maintained earlier, had begun to thin. She disliked uncertainty. She always had. Control to her meant knowing every detail before anyone else did. She asked what I thought I was proving by leaving mysterious objects on her dining table. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer drama. I simply explained that the house we were sitting in was not as straightforward as she believed. Years ago, when she had struggled to secure financing, I had signed for the mortgage so she could move forward with the purchase. The loan, at least in part, still carried my name. The information did not land the way I expected. Rachel laughed, not because she found it amusing, but because dismissal was her favorite defense. She insisted that paperwork from years ago meant nothing now. In her mind, the house belonged to her. End of discussion. Her husband shifted in his chair. I could see the confusion in his eyes. He had never been part of those early financial conversations. Like many things in their marriage, the details had stayed with Rachel alone. The room grew heavier. No one accused me of lying, but no one accepted my words either. Doubt hovered in the air, thick and uncomfortable. The envelope suddenly seemed more significant, even though it remained unopened. I stayed calm. I had learned that truth did not need volume to be heard. It only needed time. Rachel attempted to redirect the conversation, speaking about upcoming work projects and school schedules, as if nothing important had been said. Her voice carried the same confident rhythm she used with clients, steady and controlled. But something had shifted. Her husband listened more closely now. The children grew quieter. Even the walls seemed to absorb the tension. I did not push. I did not argue. I let the weight of my words settle on their own. For years, I had filled every uncomfortable moment with reassurance. Tonight, I allowed discomfort to exist. Rachel eventually stood, gathering plates with sharp, efficient movements. Her actions were quick, purposeful, meant to signal the end of the conversation. The envelope remained on the table, ignored but not forgotten. As she moved about the kitchen, I noticed the slight stiffness in her posture. Confidence, when challenged, often revealed itself in small ways. Her husband glanced at the envelope again, then at me. He did not ask questions, but his silence was no longer passive. It was thoughtful. That was enough for me. I had not come to shock them yet. I had come to prepare them. Rachel returned to the table, her expression composed once more. She informed everyone that the discussion was over and that there was no reason to make things more complicated than necessary. I did not disagree. Complications were coming whether she welcomed them or not. The house felt different now, less like a place of certainty and more like a space holding unresolved truths. The air carried a quiet awareness that something important had been uncovered, even if it had not yet been understood. I folded my hands and remained where I was. There was no need to gather my things. There was no need to explain further. The envelope and the key stayed exactly where I had placed them, not as a threat, not as a performance, but as a reminder that control was not permanent, and that some truths could not be dismissed simply because they were inconvenient. Rachel believed the situation was still hers to manage. She had no idea how close she was to losing that privilege. If you feel like something big is about to happen, comment number 4 below and stay with me, because this is where everything starts to change. The room felt smaller than it had moments before, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the truth we had been circling all evening. The envelope still rested between us, its edges worn from time, but its contents sharp with consequence. No one spoke. Even the children had fallen silent, sensing the gravity of what was about to happen. I reached for the envelope slowly. There was no need for urgency anymore. The moment had already arrived. Inside were several neatly folded pages, printed in clean official language, mortgage records, loan agreements, notices of refinancing. My name appeared where it should not have been, attached to transactions I had never approved. The signatures looked like mine, but the authority behind them was not. There was no legal power of attorney, no formal consent, nothing that made those documents legitimate. The room changed the instant I placed the papers on the table. Rachel's expression shifted from confidence to confusion, then to something closer to alarm. She leaned forward, scanning the pages too quickly to truly absorb them. Her breathing became shallow, controlled but tense. She insisted it was only routine paperwork, something every homeowner dealt with. Her words came out smooth, practiced, but the certainty behind them had weakened. Her husband stood and moved closer, reading the lines more carefully. I could see the questions forming in his mind. This was not the first time Rachel had handled finances without his involvement, but it was the first time those choices carried visible consequences. The rest of the room remained still. No one interrupted. No one dismissed what they were seeing. I explained quietly that the house had been refinanced without my legal authorization. The signatures tied me to new debt, new obligations, and new risks I had never agreed to carry. It was not just careless, it was unlawful. Rachel tried to maintain her composure, but small cracks appeared in the way she spoke, the way she held her shoulders. Control, once challenged, rarely returned easily. Her husband looked at her, then back at the papers, then at me. His silence was heavier than any accusation. For the first time that evening, Rachel did not redirect the conversation. She did not dismiss my words. She simply stared at the documents, as if hoping they might change if she looked at them long enough. I felt no satisfaction in the shift of power. There was no triumph in watching my daughter struggle to protect the image she had built. There was only clarity. For years, I had stayed quiet because I believed peace was more valuable than truth. But peace built on silence had cost me my voice, my authority, and my sense of self. Now, the truth stood in plain sight. The envelope that had once seemed mysterious now felt inevitable. Every line of ink carried weight. Every detail told the same story. Decisions had been made without me, but their consequences had been placed squarely on my shoulders. Rachel finally looked up, her expression guarded. The room waited for her to speak, but nothing convincing came. Words alone could not undo what had already been done. Her husband stepped back, folding his arms, no longer certain where his trust belonged. The children remained quiet, sensing that the adults were facing something far more serious than a family disagreement. I gathered the papers neatly and placed them back into the envelope. The truth did not need to stay on display to remain powerful. It had already taken root. This was no longer about being asked to leave a house. It was about reclaiming my place in my own life. Rachel still believed she could manage the situation. She still believed she could steer the outcome, but the room no longer belonged to her alone. For the first time in years, the balance had shifted, and this time, it was not shifting back. The silence that followed the discovery of the documents was heavier than any argument could have been. No one rushed to speak. No one tried to soften what had already been exposed. The truth had settled into the room like a weight, pressing down on every conversation that might have followed. Rachel was the first to move. She straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her blouse, as if restoring her appearance could restore her authority. She began to speak about misunderstandings, about how financial paperwork was complicated, about how mistakes happened more often than people realized. Her voice was steady, but something in her eyes betrayed her. She was no longer certain of the ground beneath her. I listened without interruption. I had spent years absorbing explanations that were meant to protect her comfort at the expense of my own. This time, I allowed her words to pass without response until they reached their natural end. Then I spoke. I explained that the situation was no longer a private family matter. The refinancing had tied my name to obligations I had never approved, exposing me to financial risk and legal responsibility. What had been done was not a misunderstanding. It was a violation. The room remained still as I laid out the two paths forward. One option was legal action, a formal complaint, an investigation, and the consequences that would follow. Lawyers would become involved. The story would leave the walls of this house and enter public record. Reputations, careers, and relationships would all feel the impact. The second option was a private resolution, a written agreement, accountability, clear boundaries that could no longer be crossed, financial transparency, no more assumptions, no more silent consent. Rachel reacted as if the floor had shifted beneath her. Her expression hardened, not with anger, but with fear. She accused me of trying to tear the family apart, of choosing conflict over compassion. Her words were sharp, but the confidence behind them had faded. Her husband did not step in this time. He watched her carefully, studying the tension in her movements, the cracks in her certainty. Trust, once fractured, rarely returned to its original shape. The rest of the family remained quiet. No one rushed to defend Rachel. No one dismissed my position. The situation had moved beyond comfort into consequence. I did not raise my voice. I did not speak with bitterness. I simply explained that I would no longer accept being placed at risk for the sake of convenience. My silence in the past had protected everyone but me. Rachel's shoulders tightened. The reality of legal consequences had begun to sink in. This was not something she could smooth over with charm or authority. The implications reached far beyond the walls of her home. I made my boundaries clear. I would not sign another document without full transparency. I would not be excluded from decisions that involved my name, my finances, or my future. I would no longer mistake family loyalty for personal sacrifice. The room felt colder, not in temperature, but in tone. Comfort had been replaced by awareness, the kind that forces people to confront what they would rather ignore. Rachel looked around the table, searching for support that did not come. Her control over the room had dissolved, replaced by uncertainty and quiet judgment. For the first time, she was not directing the conversation. I gathered the envelope, holding it calmly in my hands. The choice was hers, but the power no longer was. I had already decided how I would protect myself. The truth had done what silence never could. It had changed the balance, and once the balance shifts, it never truly returns to where it began. If you're still here and want to see how the consequences unfold, comment number 6 below to let me know. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The house did not feel the same the morning after everything was said. The familiar rhythm of breakfast, conversation, and routine had disappeared. In its place was a quiet that felt heavy, not peaceful. Doors closed more softly. Footsteps moved with caution. No one lingered in shared spaces longer than necessary. Rachel stayed in her room longer than usual. When she did come downstairs, her movements were slower, less certain. The confidence that once filled every corner of the house had thinned into something fragile. She no longer issued instructions or filled the silence with her voice. Instead, she watched, measured, and waited. Her husband had changed as well. He began spending more time reviewing paperwork, sitting at the dining table with folders spread in front of him. His conversations with Rachel were shorter, more careful. Trust, once assumed, now required proof. He no longer glanced at me with polite distance. Now, when our eyes met, there was recognition, not comfort, but awareness. The rest of the family adjusted quietly. No one dismissed my presence anymore. No one treated me like background noise. Small gestures began to shift. A chair was pulled out for me without being asked. A question about dinner plans was directed at me instead of over me. These were not grand apologies, but they were acknowledgments. I did not seek their attention. I did not explain myself further. The truth had already spoken. Rachel seemed to feel the change most sharply. The absence of automatic support unsettled her. Conversations no longer bent in her favor. Her opinions were heard, but not followed without question. For someone who had built her identity around control, the loss of unquestioned authority was deeply uncomfortable. I observed all of it without satisfaction or resentment. This was not about winning. It was about balance. There were moments when Rachel looked at me as if she wanted to speak, but the words never came. Fear often silences even the most confident voices. She understood now that her actions had consequences beyond the walls of her home. Her reputation, her career, and her family relationships were no longer insulated from her choices. The atmosphere remained tense, but not hostile. It was the kind of tension that comes with adjustment, with the slow reshaping of expectations. No one knew exactly what the future would look like, but everyone knew it would be different. I maintained my distance, not out of punishment, but out of clarity. For the first time in years, I was not filling the space with reassurance. I was allowing others to sit with their discomfort. Growth rarely happens in comfort. Rachel began to show signs of concern beyond the household. She checked her phone more frequently, spoke in quieter tones during work calls, and avoided discussing business altogether. Her professional confidence, once effortless, now carried hesitation. The weight of potential consequences followed her into every room. No one rushed to shield her from that weight, and for the first time, I did not rush to soften it either. I had spent too many years protecting others from the impact of their own decisions. In doing so, I had absorbed the cost myself. Now, I allowed responsibility to return to its rightful place. The house remained quiet, but not empty. It was filled with unspoken realizations and shifting boundaries. Relationships were being redefined without arguments or declarations, simply through changed behavior. I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. The power I had reclaimed was not loud. It did not demand attention. It existed in the calm certainty that I no longer needed to prove my worth to anyone. Rachel had lost more than authority. She had lost the illusion that silence meant agreement. And I had gained something far more valuable than control. I had gained my voice. The tension in the house did not disappear overnight, but it changed shape. It was no longer sharp or explosive. Instead, it settled into something quieter, heavier, and more deliberate. People moved with intention. Conversations were shorter, more careful. The silence was no longer avoidance, it was adjustment. Rachel approached me one afternoon in the kitchen while the rest of the house was empty. Her posture was different now. No crossed arms, no sharp tone. She stood still, as if unsure where the ground beneath her feet had gone. She did not apologize right away. Instead, she asked what I wanted to do next. I did not answer immediately. For years, I had been quick to reassure, quick to soften, quick to make things easier for everyone else. This time, I allowed the question to breathe. What I wanted was not revenge. It was not control. It was clarity. I told her that fixing what had been done would require more than promises. It would require structure, transparency, accountability, the kind that did not disappear when things became uncomfortable. I explained that every financial decision involving my name or resources would need professional oversight. No more private arrangements, no more assumptions, no more quiet expectations that I would simply agree. Rachel listened without interrupting. Her expression was serious, not defensive. That alone told me she understood the weight of the situation. I continued, outlining what rebuilding trust would actually look like. Full access to financial records, honest communication, a clear repayment plan for what had been taken without my consent. No more using our family relationship as leverage for convenience or advantage. The house, once a symbol of her independence, now represented shared responsibility. I made it clear that I would not sign anything without independent legal review. I would not accept verbal explanations in place of written documentation. My boundaries were no longer flexible. Rachel nodded slowly. She did not argue. She did not attempt to redirect the conversation. The absence of resistance spoke louder than any apology could have. The rest of the family respected the shift without comment. No one stepped in to negotiate on her behalf. No one tried to soften the terms. For the first time, my decisions were treated as final rather than optional. Inside, I felt steady, not relieved, not triumphant, just grounded. I had spent too many years trying to preserve peace by absorbing discomfort. Now, peace came from knowing I would not be placed in that position again. Rachel's confidence had not disappeared, but it had matured into something more cautious. Her words were measured. Her choices were no longer impulsive. She understood that trust, once fractured, required consistency to rebuild. I did not demand an apology. I did not ask for emotional explanations. What mattered was behavior. The house felt quieter, but also clearer. The uncertainty that once filled the space had been replaced by defined expectations. No one pretended that things could go back to the way they were. That chapter had closed. As the days passed, paperwork began to replace tension. Documents were reviewed. Meetings were scheduled. Conversations shifted from blame to responsibility. Rachel did not thank me. I did not need her to. Respect, I had learned, was not something given in words. It was shown in actions, in restraint, in acknowledgement of boundaries. I began spending more time outside the house, walking along the familiar shoreline of Cape May. The ocean still moved the same way it always had, steady and indifferent to human conflict. Its rhythm reminded me that change did not have to be loud to be powerful. The terms I had set were not punishment. They were protection. For the first time in years, I felt certain that my future would no longer depend on my willingness to stay silent. If you want to see how this story truly ends, comment number 8 below and stay with me until the final moment. The morning I left the house, The air felt lighter than it had in weeks. There was no tension in the hallways, no sharp words waiting to be spoken. The silence was not heavy this time. It was calm, almost respectful, as if the house itself understood that something important was ending. I packed slowly, folding each item with care, not because I was uncertain, but because I was deliberate. Every movement felt like a quiet affirmation of the choice I had made. This was not an escape. It was a decision. No one tried to stop me. Rachel remained in the living room, her posture still, her expression unreadable. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly had softened into something more thoughtful. She did not issue instructions. She did not offer resistance. For the first time, she simply observed. The rest of the family went about their routines without comment. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no emotional speeches. Everyone seemed to understand that this moment did not require explanation. It required acceptance. I walked through the house one last time, not with sadness, but with clarity. These walls had held years of unspoken compromise, of quiet endurance. They had also held the turning point where I finally chose myself. Outside, the morning light stretched across the driveway, steady and bright. I paused for a moment, letting the air fill my lungs. There was no bitterness in my chest, no regret pulling me backward. Only relief. Rachel stood at the doorway, watching. She did not apologize. She did not defend herself. She looked like someone who had learned that authority without trust carried no real weight. I met her gaze without anger, without judgment. This was not about blame anymore. It was about responsibility. The house no longer felt like a place where I had to prove my worth. I had already done that, not with words, but with boundaries. As I walked away, I felt a sense of freedom I had not known in years. Not the reckless kind, but the quiet kind that comes from standing firm in your own decisions. My future no longer depended on someone else's approval. Rachel would have to face the consequences of her choices, not as punishment, but as reality. Growth does not come from comfort. It comes from accountability. And I was no longer willing to carry anyone else's burdens in silence. The road ahead felt open, not uncertain. I was not being pushed out. I was choosing to step forward. My new apartment in Charleston was small, quiet, and filled with light. There were no grand rooms, no polished surfaces meant to impress anyone, just clean windows, soft ocean air, and a sense of peace I had not felt in years. For the first time in a long while, the space around me belonged entirely to me. I spent my mornings walking along the shoreline, letting the steady rhythm of the waves remind me that change was not something to fear. It was something to accept. Every step felt grounded, unhurried, free from the need to explain myself to anyone. In the stillness, I began to reflect on the years I had spent shrinking for the comfort of others. I'd called it patience. I'd called it love. But in truth, it had been silence. Silence that protected everyone else while slowly erasing parts of me. I understood now that kindness without boundaries becomes sacrifice, and sacrifice without respect becomes loss. Setting limits had never been about punishment. It was about protection. It was about choosing to value myself in the same way I had always valued my family. For too long, I believed that being needed was the same as being appreciated. Now I knew better. Rachel would have to face her own path forward. Growth, when it comes, rarely arrives gently. It arrives through accountability, through the quiet discomfort of realizing that actions carry weight. I did not wish hardship on her. I wished her clarity. There was no bitterness in my heart, only acceptance. People do not always become who we hope they will be, but we can still choose who we become in response. The greatest change was not in my circumstances, but in my sense of self. I no longer feared being misunderstood. I no longer feared being alone. I had learned that solitude, when chosen, is not emptiness, it is freedom. I had not lost my place in the world. I had simply stopped asking for permission to exist within it. The years ahead felt open, not uncertain. I did not need grand plans or dramatic resolutions. All I needed was the quiet confidence that comes from honoring my own worth. Some stories end with victory, others end with peace. Mine ended with both. Life has a way of testing our limits, not to break us, but to remind us of who we truly are. There comes a moment when silence no longer feels like peace and patience no longer feels like strength. In that moment, we learn that self-respect is not selfish and boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. True growth begins when we stop shrinking to make others comfortable and start standing firm in our own worth. We are not meant to disappear for the sake of harmony. We are meant to live with dignity, honesty, and courage. Sometimes, the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong, but finally choosing ourselves. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments, like the video, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Your support helps us continue creating content that truly matters.